Hi, and welcome to Luminaria, the podcast where we shine a light on New Mexico genealogy and history, not always in that order. My name is Kat. And just a little bit about this podcast. This just came to me about a month or two ago. I was having dinner with a friend, and I, of course, was talking about New Mexico history and how much I love being there, and a little bit about my genealogy, and of course, was probably talking a little too much about it. And she stopped and said, "Why don't you have a podcast about this? You should totally do a podcast about this." And I just stared at her for about 30 seconds and then spent the rest of that night and the next couple of days wondering why I didn't have a podcast already about this. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. I love to bring it up with anybody. I feel like a lot of people need this information because I've often wondered why we're not taught more about New Mexico history and anything about this culture, or I feel like in especially American history, you just hear about the Mayflower or the Pilgrims and all this, and you really don't hear this history at all, and it's so fascinating, and there's so many facets to it too. And I brought this up to a delightful elder genealogist I was hanging around with, Dr. Ralph Salas in Southern Colorado. I asked him, why don't people know about this? I asked people about this or tell them about it, and they had no idea. And he said, "Sweetheart, you're going to have to write the book on it." And that was a wonderful suggestion, and it's been hanging over my head for years since he said that. Writing a book would be great and is, of course, on my list of things to do, but I also work full time. I do so many other things, I have so many other commitments, and taking the time to write a book and go into all of the fact checking and wanting everything to be perfect and accurate and footnoted and have everything sourced just seems so overwhelming. But a podcast, I realized I could just sit in a microphone and just talk for as long as I wanted, and I could be a real dum-dum about it, and the stakes wouldn't be as high. Maybe no one, if people don't like it, they don't have to listen. So, and then I could have other people on. I could have historians on or people who know a lot more than I do. And then I don't have to be perfect about it. So, like any creative endeavor or doing something new, there's so much hesitation about not wanting to do it unless it's going to be perfect. And you just have to go for it. And so, this will be a very imperfect podcast, but I think it'll be a lot of fun. And I feel strongly that it's our role to talk about our ancestors and share their stories. I feel like that's a major purpose of my life. And so this is going to give me an opportunity to do that. And I hope to give other people that opportunity as well. So that being said, this first episode, I just wanted to talk about how I got into my New Mexico genealogy. And it's actually a similar story to why I'm starting this podcast, because my work is incredibly stressful right now. And I just need something else to focus on and talk about and direct my energy towards something that's really positive, that reinforces my values and my identity, rather than just being exhausted from work and thinking about work all the time. And that's how I got into genealogy. I was about probably, well, it's been over 10 years now, so probably like 12, 13 years. I was the director of a child welfare nonprofit, and it was incredibly stressful. And I just needed to, again, direct my energy just to think about something else at the time. And I, of course, foolishly fell into the trap of ancestry.com's free 2-week trial, which is such a scam because you're never going to find everything that you want to know. in 2 weeks. So they know they have you hooked. And here now, years later, exorbitant price increases. I'm still on ancestry.com. So it worked, guys. Great marketing ploy. So growing up, I'm what you would call an old soul. Um, I'm actually probably a lot younger than you would think. But all of my interests align with, um, I, I tend to be the youngest person in all the activities that I do. So Google keeps track of you and your internet activity, and they put together an ad profile for you so they know what ads to target towards you. And so I looked up my profile one time, ready to be creeped out that they would know so much about me. And Google had my profile that I was a English speaking female, age 65 plus. And at the time, I think I was maybe 30. So I would be what you would call an old soul. I've always been interested in history. I've always been interested in old stuff, old places, elders. I just spent most of my childhood just sitting around listening. I'm the youngest of 6 children. I was a going out of business sale baby. So my parents were they had already been parents a long time by the time I came around. And I was the youngest on both sides of my family. So I spent a lot of time with dogs. And then adults. I just didn't spend, there weren't a lot of other children around. So I just soaked up a lot of their stories. I was close with my mother's 2 sisters and spent a lot of time with them in that ancestral home. And we really just spent more time with my mom's side of the family, which is sort of Irish, Protestant. Well, those are 2 different things. Some of the lines were Irish, some of them are sort of more like Protestant, going back to the Revolutionary War, more traditional stories. I came to the Midwest to farm, and I was very interested in those stories from a young age. I loved the old house that my aunt lived in, that had been in our family since 1903 or 1905 or so, and didn't know really much about my dad's side of the family. We really didn't spend very much time with my dad's side of the family at all. I think I've actually met my grandmother maybe twice, three times, maybe. Yeah, 3 times that I remember. And she passed away when I was about 13, I think. And we really just didn't spend a whole lot of time with that side of the family, and I just didn't know much about it. I knew that my dad grew up speaking Spanish. I knew that his whole family spoke Spanish. He was raised in Colorado Springs. And I remember somebody asked me I think I was maybe like in middle school or something like that, asked me, I have a Hispanic last name. So they thought I was Mexican. And my explanation was, well, no, we're not Mexican, but there were just these small communities that lived in the mountains that were very isolated, so they kept the Spanish language going. I think I kind of made that up. I don't actually know where that information would have come from. But it turns out I was kind of right when I found out the truth about our culture. I just knew, like, my grandma did call us mija, but there was no awareness or my dad didn't ever talk about his family, or like, I just only knew a few things about his personal growing up. So I never connected, even though I was closer with my mom's side of the family or just around them more. I never connected to that kind of Irish ancestry. And I just kind of always felt very outside of my family on that maternal side, that I was just around all of the time. I just never quite felt aligned. And then as an adult, I was a real vagabond, traveled around the country, just kind of exploring. And I made a real effort to get to know my dad's side of the family. So I visited my aunt, who I'd never really spent time with, my uncle, um, my grandfather, who's not my biological grandfather, but just kind of made a concerted effort to get to know that side of the family better. And it just really felt like home. It just felt like so much more aligned and resonated so much. They were very warm. Um, there was just something clicked. And it felt like something had been missing. And so, sort of fast forward to this like 2010, 2011, 2012 period. I had just gotten married, I just bought a house, and I had this very stressful job. And so, just to sort of relieve stress and focus on something else, I did that trial. And I started out with my Pacheco side, which is my father's mother. And I actually don't remember why. I think it's because my dad had a handwritten piece of paper, I guess from my grandmother, that had the actual, a bit of a family tree on it. And so she did have some names and some locations. So I had something to go off of. So I think maybe that's why I got started on that line. Fortunately, I had no idea at the time. Pacheco is it's not the most common name. So I actually found them right away, and they were in northeastern New Mexico. And there was so much there right away, and I didn't really know what I was seeing. I was seeing that they were clearly Spanish speaking, but they were living in northeastern New Mexico, which I didn't at that time associate with Hispanic culture. I didn't really know very much about it. I just knew I was in Oklahoma at the time. It's right next to New Mexico. I really didn't have a real understanding about like a completely different cultural context and geographical context. So I just sort of was like, well, this is weird that these Spanish speaking people are just kind of chilling in northeastern New Mexico. Like I went to college in Colorado. And so going through from Oklahoma to Colorado and back in college, I'd been through that corridor through Clayton and Raton a zillion times. And that's where they lived. And I had no idea all of those years. And in my discoveries, I met cousins through ancestry.com. I like to say that it's like an online dating site, but you're all related. And I met my soulmate, my ancestry soulmate on Ancestry, who is my cousin Robin. Her grandfather and my great grandfather were brothers, and we're very close. And so that really just adds so many layers because she was just as enthusiastic as I was. She'd been doing it for a little longer, and she had the privilege of actually living with her grandfather. He lived to be, I think, 105. And she actually got to live with her grandparents, and both of her parents were from the Manita culture, and so there was a lot more. She got a lot more of that context and like family stories and stuff like that I had none of. So we just started comparing notes, and a lot of the research we were finding actually lined up with the family stories, which was really cool. More on that later. And we started taking trips to New Mexico together, which was just some of my greatest memories. So much fun, just walking the land, just driving out in the middle of nowhere, trying to find, this cemetery or, this family estate or whatever, and hopping over fences at Los Luceros back before it was opened as a historic site, which is so exciting now. But back then, we had to hop the fence. And so I just started gradually learning more about New Mexico history. What's weird is that I took a lot of Southwest Studies classes in college, and a lot about I remember learning about Chaco culture and just had just no idea that that was in my history at all. That was my family's, those are my family's stories. I had no idea. And I actually remember a good friend of mine, Antonio, in college. I remember on the first day of college, we were lived in the same dorm and we had to introduce ourselves. And he brought, he had like a little jelly jar or something of New Mexico soil. He was from Albuquerque. And he was talking about how much New Mexico meant to him, that he was, like had been there, family had been there for so many generations, that this land was everything to them. It was in his blood. And I remember him talking about that so distinctly. And again, I had zero idea that I was also from that culture as well. So it was just wild to think back on how little I knew about my own family history, and all of these treasures that I found out later. I just had no idea. And it just really started this whole journey. I did start with the Pachecos and discovered so much about them because there's so much. They turned out to be an extremely prominent family. My great grandfather was very prominent man. His father was a very prominent man. More on that later. And I just gradually started to learn about the context surrounding that these people had come over hundreds of years earlier and had been there, as they say, that the U.S. border crossed them, like they didn't cross the border. I just had no idea about any of that context and just became more and more fascinated and have since tried to do as much as I can. But again, I do work full time. So, and I just have all the, volunteer commitments. There's just, so much caring for my parents that it has been hard to find time to really delve in because you really need those like big chunks of time. Like it's hard to just do it an hour a day or even a couple hours a week because, you're a detective. So you kind of got to keep the thread in your head. And I miss it. There's something. I have a tendency to sort of get lost in other people's identities or ideas, or it's just sort of my default. I'm an Enneagram 9, if anybody knows the Enneagram. And so this is something that ties me to what's important to me, why I'm here. And I think I really need to focus on that more. So it's also became clear to me that, as I started learning about epigenetics, which is a sort of new field of study that we really carry things through our DNA from our ancestors. So that there are a lot of they tend to study things like health outcomes, of course, because that's where research happens. So things like I'm going to get this wrong again. This is not going to be a perfect. I don't have a fact checker. It's just me. So I'm just going to talk, and then if I need to do a correction later, I will. But like they'll look at, I think it was like in Sweden, maybe, where when there had been a famine, the grandchildren of those who had been through the famine, particularly during puberty, had higher incidence of diabetes. And so they're finding that, because your grandparents, for example, went through this hardship, their bodies actually had to make some changes to adapt. And so then that literally changed the way that your parents evolved and then you evolved, to have your insulin be able to, or your body fat or something like that, be able to sustain famine, because that was like an adaptive response that your biologically occurred like in the womb, and particularly things that happen when a baby's in the womb, depending on what the mother is going through at that time, is a really, really, when you learn these stories about your ancestors, you really have to think about like what is the impact of that I would say like more they do study more like traumatic things that happen and the effects of that. But just on a larger scale, like if a mom is going through a really traumatic time when she's pregnant, then her baby, she's like releasing certain stress hormones. And so the baby then will have a change in their stress hormones as well for the rest of their life, meaning that they're going to struggle with things like emotional regulation, long-term planning, impulsive behavior. It's just really fascinating. If you haven't looked into epigenetics, there's just like so many interesting facets to it. And to me, that says that what happened to our ancestors and the experiences that they had are impacting our lives today. It's impacting how our bodies metabolize, how our brain chemistry is working. And I kind of wonder, I've just always been odd and kind of serious minded and just like felt things very deeply or like been very sensitive, like from a very, very young age. And I just wonder, I have to wonder as I learn the stories of my ancestors, like, am I like carrying the trauma of my ancestors? Like, was I born like with, it feels like the weight of some of these things that they went through. And then that's why I feel like maybe it's my job is to tell some of those stories and shine a light on those experiences. And that was another thing that I found, because I have done some of that genealogy on my mom's side of the family as well. And it's interesting because on Ancestry, you can see other people's trees, right? So when you're looking at a specific person, you can see how many other people have that person on their tree. And so on my maternal side of the family, there's like just a zillion people who have worked on these people, who have them in their trees. There have been like books written or whatever. And then when I was looking up my paternal side, there was hardly anybody. Now, that's changed quite a bit in the last decade because people have gotten more into genealogy. But it really just, I felt like I didn't want their lives to have been in vain and their experiences and their sacrifices. That, they had these incredibly hard lives and made all these sacrifices, and now it feels like a miracle that I'm here. That's the gist you get from genealogy too, right? That you're just like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm here. Like there was just so much that had to happen for me to actually be alive right now, given all the adversity and also just random things that kill you. One of my favorite things is looking at mortality schedules. So reading all of the totally bizarre ways that people died. And so it just felt like they had lived these lives and then it was done. Like no one was talking about them. No one was acknowledging those sacrifices. Nobody was saying their names. And it felt like I was shining a light on them. Like every time I found new information about somebody in my tree who literally nobody else was looking at or had researched or added or whatever, it just felt like bringing them forward into a light and honoring their life, whatever that looked like. And I feel like that's really important, especially because they're a part of us. They're a part of us today as we're living out our daily lives. And I definitely feel like there's a big spiritual component to genealogy, that you just feel tied to this long line. Like I can see a long line of people behind me. And it can be a complicated relationship because sometimes I feel guilty because, I'm the things I'm worried about on a daily basis when I think about my ancestors. I imagine my ancestors rolling their eyes a lot, and just being like, oh my God, like she has no idea, this chick. We watched, my partner and I watched tried to watch Salt of the Earth the other night. And I had never seen it. And I got 22 minutes in before I was just crying, just overcome. And my partner thought I was thinking about our cat that we lost earlier this year, and just didn't even, he was clearly not experiencing this film the same way that I was. And I was having just this like extreme emotional response to seeing, first of all, people from our culture. I don't know that I have seen them represented very often in any kind of medium at all. And so seeing those people very much, clearly representative of my ancestors and how hard their lives were. And I think the at the 22-minute mark or whatever, there was a woman who looked just like my grandmother. And so I think that's when I kind of lost it. And so that, I feel like that's a little complicated, but also, especially as a woman and looking back on the relationships that the women probably had with their spouses, especially those that were often like 14. A lot of my great grandmothers were 14 and their husbands were, like 48 or something. It's actually very meaningful for me to have a positive relationship with like my partner or husband or whatever, and to be, stepping into a leadership role or doing all the little things that I do in my life. All of those women, like I'm doing it for them, right? Like they didn't have the opportunity to do that, or. So hopefully they're not rolling their eyes. Hopefully they're like, yes, this is what we couldn't have imagined this future for our descendants. So I don't know. I feel like it just adds so many layers to my life and to my existence. And especially I feel like American culture is very fractured and overwhelming, overstimulating. Just a lot of focusing our attention on things that are not real or things that aren't really important when it comes down to it. That this ties me to something real, that I'm grounded in this history. It kind of brings me to a place where I can understand more, like be more centered and where I need to be. So, and then, just getting so much strength from their stories. I was, as most people did, had a rough couple of years these last few years, and thinking back on like my grandmother and what her life was like. I remember my Aunt Suzette. We were talking about my grandmother. My Aunt Suzette was pretty close to her. And she was telling me some stuff about her, and I was sharing some of the stuff that I had found out through research that she didn't know. And she was telling me what a strong person she was, and that's where my strength comes from. And it got me, for sure. And then I think we do like I was saying, like just having a positive relationship with a husband or a partner is such a new experience for women historically. I mean, in all kinds of cultures, but just breaking generational cycles of trauma, of violence, of dysfunction. Um, I have to think that uh, our ancestors are behind that and are cheering us on and are part of our spiritual team that's helping us along the way. So that's just a little bit about how I got into genealogy. Here's a little bit of what I have planned for upcoming episodes. I will start out with a little bit just going through my first lines. It won't all be me waxing poetic about ancestry and genealogy. And it will be mostly, hopefully, focused on like people's stories of like really great finds that they've, what's your favorite find? And where did you find it? How did you find it? How did your family accept that? I, in my genealogy, have run into a lot of situations where I discovered something that was not accepted by the family. For example, on my mom's side of the family, she had always said, so we had this big ancestral home, right? And supposedly, her mother moved into the house as a boarder, as a young woman, because her grandmother, my mother's grandmother, her husband died, and so she had this big house and kids to raise, and so she had to take in boarders. And my grandmother was one of those boarders. She met my grandfather. They fell in love, and it was kind of the sweet story. Well, first of all, when my grandmother was a boarder, I did find her as a boarder in the house. She was 22 and she was a teacher and she was engaged to somebody. And my grandfather was living in the house, so that is how they met. But he was in high school. He was 18, maybe even younger. And they did fall in love, and it's kind of a creepy story, to be honest. But also, grandfather was alive during this whole creepy situation. He was very much alive, living in the house. So they actually, for whatever reason, took on boarders. Was it during the Depression? So presumably it was just for economic reasons that they took in boarders. And my grandmother was one of them, but he was alive. And so I was all excited to share this information with my mom. And she was just like, no, that's not what happened. He was dead. And I was like, well, I don't think the census enumerators could count like ghosts or dead, like corpses or anything like that. Like, I think he had to have been alive when he was recorded in the census. And she just flat out refused to believe this was truth. So I'm curious to hear, I love talking with people about genealogy. I hope to have a couple of different historians on and people who do stuff with New Mexico history. I love the history of like all these small towns that don't exist anymore that our families are from. So I want to talk more about those and kind of flesh out, bring those towns to life a little bit as like our society just moves more and more towards urban areas. Those rural areas are just kind of becoming lost. And so that's a shame. And talking to, I have a whole list of guests that I would love to have if I can figure out how to interview people remotely. I will hopefully have an occasional co-host in my cousin Robin, who does so much research. She's so knowledgeable. She's just spent so much time working on like up trees for a lot of different people in the Manita culture. I'm going to have some occasional book reports on books about New Mexico history that I've read. I want to have a special episode on why I don't speak Spanish, because I think that's important to talk about. There's a lot of reasons why people in our generation specifically don't speak Spanish, or the first in generation after generation who don't speak Spanish, and we need to talk about that. So I have a lot of ideas. I'm very excited. I am very energized by this project. I hope that I think that even if no one listens, that I will get a real kick out of it and will really enjoy just saying our ancestors' names, talking about them, sharing their stories, and just shining that light on them and their lives and their sacrifices and everything that they went to. And, you have to think too, as, again, they study uh, with our current sort of medical model around research and stuff like that. They tend to be kind of, problem focused. So they're going to study things like that go wrong. But you have to think that if traumatic experiences are literally altering DNA, or not altering DNA, but basically that you have when they mapped out the human genome, they thought that was going to be the ticket to everything, and then it turns out like, oh, actually there's other parts to this. Like something is turning these, just because you have those genes, like they're not all getting turned on. Something is turning them on or off. And it's sometimes as these traumatic experiences from your ancestors. So if that's true, then presumably positive things are in there as well, maybe. So I just think that we share in some of their joys, and as well as honoring their adversity, and just sort of unraveling too. I feel like in terms of identity, I see this in the our genealogy groups in New Mexico and southern Colorado, that there's a lot of conversations in the last couple of years about identity in terms of like, I think older generations grew up just like we have pure Spanish blood. Obviously now with the advent of DNA and finding more records and great projects like Native Unbound, discovering our indigenous ancestry as well as like African influences and history and ancestors as well. It's just so layered, and I would love to have more of those conversations as well, especially because racial and ethnic identity is such a huge part of our conversation. There's a lot of movement around the country to not educate people about a complicated history, or to not want to present a complicated history. And that's just the reality of our culture and our background. This is very complicated, and it can't be summed up very easily. So hopefully this podcasting medium kind of will lend itself to more exploration of that and just conversation about that. So those are some things that I'm hoping in the future. I am trying to be more realistic about my time limitations, but you have to force yourself sometimes to do things that are good for you and to make time. It just is really easy to just be too tired or feel like I don't have time with all the other things that I have to do. But this is something I really need to make time for. And so I'm really excited and hope to expand this. And I think it'll be really fun. That's it for now. I will be back next time to delve a little bit more into my Pacheco line, which I could be biased, but pretty fascinating. So that's it for now. Bye. Thanks for listening to Luminaria. You can reach me at luminariapod@gmail.com. Our intro and outro music is of Varsoviana, performed by Nieves Anaya and his daughter Ernestina Anaya at Arroyo Hondo, New Mexico in 1940. It's part of the Juan Bautista Rael collection at the Library of Congress.